But we start with Caroline Wilson tonight, football's First Lady. Good evening and welcome.
Craig.
And some news that's been just unearthed about a major conflict in the Hawthorn succession plan.
That's right, Craig. As we know, there has been genuine doubt in my mind that this plan is ever going to work. We knew before today that Sam Mitchell was not particularly keen on working with Alastair Clarkson next year. We also knew that Alastair Clarkson had serious doubts about whether he could work with Sam Mitchell effectively as his boss, making list management decisions, strategy decisions, etc. Last weekend, we know that Hawthorn went over to Tasmania and gave a pretty terrible performance against Fremantle. We now know that senior players were really disappointed and blindsided, in fact, by the Jeff Kennett co-announcement of this coaching succession plan. This was, first of all, before I tell you what happened last week, Alastair Clarkson after that game in Tasmania.
Yeah, it's hard to say. You know, based on today's performance, you'd say, oh yeah, geez, they look flat. But as I said, we got a young side. We had some injuries, and we couldn't win the ball in the middle of the ground. So, how much do you link all that?
Fast forward to last Wednesday, boys, and this is Jeff Kennett in a breakfast radio interview on SEN.
Suffice to say, this is typical of sports journalists, of which there are thousands, and they're all trying to create their own story, and they put something out there without any proof, or are they prepared to name anyone? They're both mature men. Clarko will be our coach next year. He will have his staff around him. Sam will continue as both development coach at Hawthorn, but also his role as coach of Box Hill.
How do you think it's been received?
From the players, very well.
I'm not so sure about that, particularly some of the senior players. That interview was last Wednesday morning, Matthew. On that day, there was a mediation session held at the Hawthorn Football Club involving Sam Mitchell, Alastair Clarkson, the head of footy, Rob McCartney, I understand was there, and leading teams boss Ray McLean. Now, the club has said to me today that it is not really fair to call it a mediation session, that Ray McLean is a consultant to the football club.
You think they brought a broker in to get them on the same page and it didn't go well?
Depending on who you talk to, there are several versions of why this meeting was held. There is a version which says that there was concern that Alastair had gone into his shell to a degree, was not coping with the announcement and was not necessarily happy about working with Sam. There's another version which says that they just needed to sort things out and that perhaps Sam wasn't particularly happy. Anyway, I'm told that during that meeting it became clear that Sam Mitchell would rather have clean air, to have a fresh start next year without Alastair Clarkson by his side. When this meeting took place, and you can remind you, this happened after a pretty flattening loss against the Fremantle Footy Club, I think Alastair sort of went along with this, according to some sources at the Hawthorn Football Club, and it was put to Rob McCartney or Ray McLean to report this back to the footy subcommittee, a subcommittee that I think is chaired by Richie Vandenberg. Now, whether or not that happened, I don't know. This is what Justin Reeves, I should say, I put all of this to the Hawthorn CEO today, and he denies that there is any friction between Sam Mitchell and Alastair Clarkson, apart from the obvious. He says that we're happy with the way things are going. They're working well together. To be honest, they're actually working together better than we expected. Now, I'm not quite sure that is right, but what I do know is that what happened on the weekend was an unbelievable, unexpected, inspiring performance by the Hawks, and a decision, I think, by the feeling is from the players that Alastair has never been more engaged this year than he was after that win, and he is now digging in and is not prepared necessarily to leave despite Sam Mitchell's wishes.
So let's make some sense of that. So you're saying there was...
Couldn't be much clearer, Craig.
No, you can. The mediation last Wednesday.
Yep.
It didn't go well.
No.
Sam Mitchell told... Are you saying that Sam directly told Alastair he doesn't want him there next year?
I don't think it might have been that strong. I think it was, I think those at the meeting felt that Sam Mitchell made it clear that he wanted to be the coach next year and he would prefer to be there without Alastair Clarkson.
And has that made Alastair more determined to dig his heels in?
Well, I think that the feeling last week, and, I've talked about Alastair and his connection, I believe, with Carlton. I think as time has gone on, Alastair has seriously started thinking about maybe not coaching at all next year. But, of course, he has to be paid out by Hawthorn. If he doesn't coach, he doesn't get paid. And he's got a contract.
And Jeff's not going to pay him without him coaching. They're too stubborn on this, aren't they?
What do Hawthorn officials want, Caro? What do you think Justin Reeves and Jeff Kennett want?
Justin Reeves tells me he wants the succession plan as they have announced it. I personally believe that if Jeff Kennett had his way and if it wasn't going to cost him more than $1 million, Sam Mitchell would be the senior coach of the Hawthorn Football Club next year. My view is it's a mess. And I don't think it was a good idea. That's my view.
The most amazing thing, Caro, is that why wouldn't they have had this mediation before this major announcement? Surely you've got to work out whether this succession plan is going to work and whether Alastair and Sam Mitchell can work together. Why are they having this 3 weeks after the event when they've announced to the football world that these two are going to get along and make it work when clearly they're not?
Well, I don't believe that it's going to be easy for either of them. As I said, Justin Reeves, to be fair, I've put this to him today and he's denied it. But I am still told by
But he didn't
people...
deny that the mediation happened. He just denied that it was mediation.
If that was to occur, Hutchie, the way Caro has said it, do you think it's wrong by Sam Mitchell to be saying, if you've agreed to it, only a week or so ago, to be saying, I want clean air, I want to be the coach of the footy club? I understand how difficult list management's going to be, and I think Sam should be the decision maker in that regard, which makes it tricky. But to look Clarko in the eye and say, I want to be the coach
I just can't.
next year.
My position hasn't changed. This can't work. How can we be in mediation 2 weeks into the rollout of this?
And here's Sam Mitchell, of course, against Melbourne with Lachlan Bramble, one of his Box Hill boys, who's now come onto the senior team in the mid-season draft. Look, I think the other issue for me is that Sam Mitchell obviously has great relationships, particularly with the boys he's been coaching at Box Hill, and the senior players certainly last week were blindsided by this decision regarding Alastair Clarkson, and they love Alastair Clarkson.
Do you think it's a reasonable view of Sam to have?
No, I think I would, once the club has made the decision that it's one more year for Alastair Clarkson, the year after for Sam, whether you like it or you don't, you just got to dig in yourself and plan for the year after.
And in hindsight, Lordo, I think Sam Mitchell was the one that was expendable, really, just through circumstance, because he was out of contract. Alastair Clarkson had one more year to go. If you don't want to sack Alastair and pay him out, Caro, well then you have to move Sam Mitchell on and say, yeah, we'd love to keep you, Sam, but unfortunately circumstances don't allow it. We're going to go with Clarko.
They won't be doing that, Kane.
But in hindsight, and that's what I said at the time, that would have been the logical thing to do. Now you've got this mess where we're going to be speaking about this a lot. We're 3 weeks into a succession plan that's got 18 months to go and it's going to be spoken about most weeks. What a distraction.
I know we've got to move on, but I just want to say one more time, it seems to me that things changed again after the Melbourne game, which is just fascinating. That, there is no doubt, and I felt this all year, that Alastair Clarkson has rarely been more engaged and focused on the job at hand.
Caro, can't be changing based on that. You can't be changing on a whim that you play poorly, then you start playing better. No, they've got to be stronger than that.
Look, I don't pretend to understand Alastair Clarkson. He's a very complex man. But you've found out you've effectively been sacked with a year's notice and you have a really bad loss and you're feeling pretty flat and maybe you are thinking I should just walk away.
I'm with you. Sam, it's hard. He's got to bite his tongue. He's got to inherit whatever team he gets in 15 months. He's got to trust that Alastair will leave it in reasonable nick. He's pretty lucky to have the gig probably in the first place.